So one sector in society where VR and AR are really a thing is healthcare. And a couple of different ways in which those methods, those new media are used in healthcare that are different but sort of related. So one example is surgery simulation. So you can imagine if you're a doctor and there's a difficult surgery coming up, you want to practice this, right? Before you start on your actual client or your actual patient. So it could be super nice to sort of simulate the exact surgery in a virtual way, such that you can practice a bit, such that if you make a mistake, this doesn't have any fatal consequences. So this is what people are developing now. Surgeons are practicing first in VR on a virtual patient that looks very much like a real patient, like a real client. They practice what they have to do on their real patients. And then afterwards, once they master this surgery completely, they go to their actual patient and carry it out. So it's really a way of practicing the things that they have to do to make the chance that they make a mistake as small as possible, basically. Another example is phobia treatment. That's a bit different. So of course, all sorts of phobia exists. People have the craziest things they're afraid of. For instance, you can be afraid of spiders, of course, right? But you can also be afraid of public speaking, or you can be afraid of heights. You can be afraid of large public spaces. And typically in the past, you would then, if you wanted to be treated for such a phobia, you would go to your therapist or to your doctor and you would say, well, I want to be treated on this. And what happened often in the past is that, for instance, people would talk about this and then hoping that this phobia would become less influential in people's everyday life. Another type of therapy that has been developed is so-called exposure therapy. So that would mean that gradually you would be exposed to the thing you're afraid of. And then over time, the hope was that this phobia that you would have would disappear because you would notice that nothing really bad would happen to you. So if you imagine you're afraid of spiders, for instance, in the first session with a therapist, you would talk a bit about spiders. Then in the second session, if everything goes well, you would look at a picture of a spider that's really far away in the room. And at some point, maybe during session 10, there would be like an actual spider in the room. And then you would notice, well, nothing bad really happens. So it's gradually, slowly, more and more, you would sort of lose your phobia for this thing you're afraid of. And this actually works relatively well. But the problem is, of course, that it's not always possible to get like an actual spider. And also in the case of, for instance, fear of heights, this kind of exposure therapy would expose you to heights. Every new session, you would, for instance, go to a slightly higher building, but still there's always a risk, right, that something goes wrong. So if people start panicking because they have this phobia of height, they might accidentally cause some accident or cause some harm. Well, long story short, of course, people now have been developing exposure therapies using virtual reality. So session by session, you would be exposed to the thing you're afraid of in a virtual environment. So for instance, during session 5, there will be a virtual spider in the same virtual room as where you are at a large distance. And if everything goes well, the next session, this virtual spider would come a bit closer and then gradually you're sort of exposed to what you're afraid of. And for many people, this helps. So their phobia sometimes even completely disappear, but often also get decreased in such a way that they can sort of live their lives without this constant fear being there. Another example is training of medical students in healthcare. So here again, it's all about practice, right? So often in the past, and this is still the case, when medical students would be practicing the things they would have to do once they would be a doctor after their studies, they would often practice even on dead bodies, people with disease, who allowed students to practice on their bodies after they had died. Of course, this is in a way nice because you can practice, and if you make a mistake, if something bad happens, it doesn't have consequences that it would have on an actual person. But of course, those bodies are not always available to everyone, to all students, right? Well, it can be much nicer to just practice your skills as those surgeons are doing on virtual patients that look like an actual patient, that look like an actual person. And if you make a mistake because you're a student and you're still practicing, it doesn't have any consequences because you're a virtual patient doesn't feel any hurt, right? Or you can practice whatever you like. Also, patient communication is used more and more. So this is also in healthcare an important issue. So of course, as a doctor, you're constantly talking to people. And you should do this in a nice way, in the right way. But those patients might often be very stressed. They might be scared for things. So it really needs some communicative skills to treat those patients in a nice way, such that they don't get even more stressed or even more angry or what have you. So this also can be practiced, for instance, in VR. So you can practice and talk to virtual interlocutors that respond in certain ways as in the ways that actual patients also now and then do. And you can practice, how should I respond? And if I respond like this, what will happen? And this you can practice your communication skills. And finally, a very interesting development is so-called virtual therapists in healthcare. So you can imagine that it's indeed sometimes hard to talk to an actual therapist because you might be ashamed of something, or you might be scared to talk about something. And perhaps, even though this won't be the case, you might be afraid that some doctor will judge on you. Now, what if we can develop some virtual therapists that are completely virtual, that doesn't exist as real persons, that don't have any memory? So if you tell them something, the next day they will have forgotten because they're virtual. It can be programmed that they just forget everything they hear. So can you really just talk to virtual therapists, tell your story, and they respond in a natural way. And this could sort of lead to some relief. The nice thing about this is that, especially in the Netherlands, there are like those long waiting lists for people who want to speak to a therapist, whereas a virtual therapist could be available all the time, right? During the day, at night, during the weekend, immediately when you need this virtual therapist. And here you see a picture, a screenshot from the Institute for Creative Technologies in Southern California, where they're actually working on this, creating virtual therapists to interact with actual persons, actual people who want to talk about their problems. And what's interesting about this is that the facial movements, the facial behavior, and also the hand gestures of an actual person are then tracked while that person is talking to the virtual therapist, and the therapist responds to this. So let's have a look at a short video in which this is being described.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
Yes.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself. When was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not someone who's really like, I don't have any real highs. I feel like I'm a level person. It's just happy. I guess to answer your question, probably a couple months ago.
I noticed you were hesitant on that one. Would you say you are generally a happy person?
I'm generally happy. It's just lately there are things just keeping me down.
Well, I guess you get the general gist there. So of course, what you see here is a nice example of tracking behavior, right? So we talked about tracking last week as a critical element in VR, also in AR, MR. And here you really see that people's speech is being tracked, right? What they say is being tracked. Their facial expressions are being tracked. Their movements are being tracked. And online, this virtual therapist responds to this. Of course, what you see here on the left is a person not wearing any headset, right? So I think the real challenge for the future will be to really integrate this even more into VR. Because of course, once people start wearing headsets, you no longer see parts of their face, right? So it might also be harder to actually track their facial movements or facial expressions, even their speech perhaps. So perhaps here also augmented reality could be more relevant, more interesting than virtual reality, because it still allows, it gives you more room to track people's facial behavior and then have, in this case, a virtual therapist respond to this.